Hi, I'm Wild Bill, and I'm infamous for tilting at windmills. And if you don't know why that's funny, you should read more. Anyway, I'm going to address the most delicate, the most emotionally charged topic of all time and space. One about which each of us humans wonders, at least once in his or her life. The concept of, the potential existence of, or the non-existence of, an afterlife. Before I start, I want to make a disclaimer here. I do not throw stones at anyone's stained glass windows here. I'm not trying to denigrate any of the faiths. I'm not trying to say that anyone's belief structure is wrong. There's a lot of that going on in the world, and I'm not part of it. My background, my parents' teachings, was Christian. I have a deep and abiding respect for the peoples of the book. The three major faiths inside the book, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, which is the sun source of all our ideas. But I do not want to insult anyone by my thoughts on topic. I'd like to start with the idea as to how differently our various conceptions of an afterlife could be. The Greeks believed in a couple of different ideas. Elysium was one, and I think Tartarus was the other. And in Elysium, you would drink from the river Lethe, and you would lose all your memories, and you would live on as a happy shade, surrounded by animals and trees and bushes and flowers and trees and chirping birds, and that would be your eternity. That was for, of course, the most graced. Others would live like a dull shadow existence, sort of like ours, but with much less to do, bored forever. And of course the evil would be punished in the lowest levels in Tartarus, in hell where the titans were chained. Well, then we go to Buddhism. In Buddhism, there are so many different doctrines of afterlife that it's difficult to pin them down and call them Buddhism. But I will start with the central precepts of Buddhism, two of which I think are pertinent to this discussion. The second, which refutes the whole idea of the bodhisattva, in the first place, the elevated individual who stays behind to help us achieve enlightenment instead of going into enlightenment himself or herself. That's what a bodhisattva is. A near deity, who's just I'm going to tarry a while and help Wild Bill understand something, which violates the second law of Buddhism. What is the second law of Buddhism? Thank you for letting me run on. That enlightenment can't be taught. Ding, ding, ding. Look it up. And everything in Buddhism almost violates the first fundamental precept of Buddhism. The first law of Buddhism is, and it's from the great man's mouth himself, according to his students, there are no heavens, there are no hells, there is no afterlife, there are no gods and goddesses, there are no demons and devils, there is nothing beyond what our senses can detect. That's what his revelation was. Realize he comes from India, which is a place that has a rich religious tradition, which is pretty much codified in Brahmanism and used to be, I think, Jainism, in which there are many gods and many goddesses and many afterlives and many things you can do and many places you could be tortured and many things that happen, and a greater understanding at every level till you realize I'm just an ant, and then you go to the next level where you're very powerful and you realize eventually I'm just an ant. You go to the next level and eventually you disappear. Or you come back and start over again. Now, according to what I know about Buddhism, though, I'm not talking about Hinduism or Jainism at this moment, Buddhism states that there are none of these things. There are no heavens, there are no hells, there are no angels, there are no demons. And that you should do the best you can in life because that's the shot you get. The fact that an innumerable plethora of cults have built up calling themselves Buddhism that do not adhere to those two precepts. One is no afterlife, no superior beings, no inferior beings, no archetypal good or evil. And the second law of Buddhism, which is you can't teach enlightenment. That these have been ignored. And so you have gurus teaching Buddhist enlightenment. Well, in India they're gurus. Guru and rabbi can be interchanged. They're not necessarily holy designations. They mean teacher. Sensei in Japanese. Sifu in, I think, Mandarin Chinese. They all mean the same thing generally, teacher. The student assigns what authority he wishes, or that he wills, to the teacher. But the teacher doesn't necessarily have any authority. I don't know any teachers since our archetypes appeared, right? If you're people of the book, well, then you believe that Moses existed, and then Abraham made a pact with God, that Noah was the first person to recognize, that all these wonderful things happened, this whole list of patriarchs. And they're all, of course, Judaic patriarchs, or proto-Judaic patriarchs. They're all part of the same line, the same bloodline that leads to, we expect, every human being today, if you believe the flood tales are literal. The genetic evidence seems to indicate it's a little different, but science, again, is just as prone to fads and cults and schisms as religion. As a matter of fact, I personally feel that science is one philosophy, empirical science, science codified as an institution with a capital S, is a philosophy. And so is each religion. All of science, all of religion, alchemy, astrology, they are all means of trying to explain the world with the tools at hand. Explain why the night sky gets dark. Explain why the stars twinkle. Explain why the ants found that honey I was saving. So, science, as a doctrine, does bring one beautiful thing to the table that I think that religion does not, and religion might benefit from. Otherwise, I think they're very much the same. Science has one way of going about it. Religions have different ways of going about it. Generally, science writes the books, so we all believe in science. Science takes the point of view that the simplest explanation that fits the data is likely the case. See how simple that is? The simplest explanation that fits the data is likely the case. It's so smooth and, right, so suave. I like that. I also hear suave things in Buddhism and other doctrines, so I'm not saying science is alone in this, but that's a pretty good one. And I'd like to bring that to this idea of an afterlife. So, here's what Wild Bill thinks as a mental exercise about the afterlife. Simplifying as much as possible to keep up with the evidence. Which is admittedly slender. You die. It might be sad for you. It might be time. I can't say. But you die. And you wake up, and there you are. There's heaven in walking distance. Gates open, you can leave and go into heaven right now. But before you go, everyone who has ever been traumatized by you gets to spank you as long as they want. Not with violence, not with weapons, not with vengeance, not with fire or ice or electricity. But like a normal spanking, you're spanking someone to discipline them. And that person that has been wronged by the subject can spank the subject as long as he or she feels is necessary. Now, when we think of how many people have been traumatized by somebody, we think of people in the West, we have names that like pop right up. I'm going to try a different one because I'm going to talk about scale compared to the times rather than total numbers, because that's unfair to everyone else that's come before. We have bigger numbers now. But back then, if you only had 30 million people on the earth and you killed 10 million, that was a major tragedy and genocide. And I'm talking about a situation somewhat like that. Genghis Khan, the Mongol ruler, he was complicit in the murder of entire nations. Towns burned to the ground, men, women, and children put to the spear. Because they said no, because they said we're out of money, because he was in a bad mood that day, for whatever reasons. He is probably responsible for a great deal of harm and sadness and despair. In his generation, percentage of the human population wise, probably the baddest man, the most evil man for his effects on the world in history. How about that? And we think of these other guys. That's peanuts. I mean, it's horrible, terrible tragedy, but we're not thinking about the times. We hear numbers because, we hear numbers. But if there were 120 million people in the world when Genghis Khan was alive, and he affected the lives of 20 million of those, which he did very easily, that's 16% of the world. That's a lot. That's a lot. Terror, the torch, plague, because that moved with the Mongols too. So, even Genghis Khan being spanked by, all the people that he wronged, maybe a lot of their progeny. Did you know that 20% or 25% of the human race has his genetic material in them? How about that? So, I guess he was successful with the girls. But even Genghis Khan eventually will look up and realize that the last person has stopped spanking him. Now allow me to say what I think is this process, so you understand that I'm not just saying a silly thing to make a silly point. I have a reason for all of this. As each person spanks Genghis Khan, or whoever, as long as they like, they will eventually look up and say to themselves, I am delaying my entry into heaven because of my attachment to the world. And they'll get up, and they'll walk away, and they'll go to heaven. That's a process of realization. That's a letting go of all the bad, all the dross, and moving forward in the next existence, leaving all the bad behind. So each person that learns that wisdom along the way and says like, hey, I'm not going to spank you anymore, old man. I'm going to get up. I'm going to walk into heaven, has achieved a great victory, a moral, ethical, and philosophical victory equal to any other, and will be deserving of heaven. Now, even Genghis Khan, in the fullness of time, will look up and see that there's nobody waiting to spank him. And he will get up and walk into heaven. What lesson has he learned? What justice has been served besides the point of the people that were the most abused gained wisdom that lifts them above that abuse, finally, at last, if they needed it? What a gift. He learns that the worst thing you can do to someone is to deprive them of their freedom. And that was the whole point in the first place. That he thinks, I don't ever want to feel like this again. That was terrible of me to be that way. And he too will let go of the world, stand up, and walk into heaven. I don't want to speculate on the nature of heaven, as I said earlier. But this is the way I look at reward and punishment without postulating a very complex system of interrelated supernatural creatures that none of us can get straight. If you ask a Mormon how many angels there are, if you ask a Catholic how many angels there are, if you ask a rabbi how many angels there are, you will get different answers, even though they all are sourced from the same material. So instead of postulating all this contentious detail, I merely open up heaven to everyone and enlightenment to everyone. Wild Bill.